And thank you, Dr. Al and Dr. Mark, for your mentorship. And I want to extend my thanks to all of you on this platform, listening in from wherever you are. I say thank you so much. To my incredible family, my wife and our two kids. My wife is Helen Momo, and our kids are Roy and Sophia. I thank you so much for the accompaniment and for the support. Then also to my work colleagues at NPJM, which is National Peace and Justice Ministries, our department within Mennonite Central Committee. I thank you so much for your accompaniment as well, and for your deep reflections, the many times that you and I tend to actively educate and then influence policies on everyday brothers and sisters in their various communities. In a very special way, I want to extend my thanks before my presentation to the faculty of Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, CJP, there in Harrisonburg, Eastern Mennonite University, for the foundations. In fact, the closure I got in integrating practice and theory is actually drawn from that reservoir and wealth of knowledge of the faculty there, and then also the students for their reflective insights. And then also, of course, to the Carter School faculty. Your pedagogy has been extremely exciting, so that has sharpened and that has also shaped me to this moment. So I want to begin by saying that today I'm just going to be sharing with you my positionality on this research, this case study, and then also I will talk about my methodology, which has to do with the data gathering and data analysis, and then also my findings in the research. Then after that, my conclusion. I want to say that there is something about being an insider and outsider. And for about a decade, I worked in Nigeria, in the northern part of Nigeria, as a religious community peace builder and peacemaker. And then after a while, I moved to the US to build my epistemology, and when I say building my epistemology, I mean embracing the technical knowledge of the Western civilization, of course, to build my toolbox. And then subsequently, I have realized that I have been involved in programming and policy, as well as even in the academia. And so thinking how all these aspects of my own experience tend to interact, that tends to play out in my learning and unlearning, which subsequently leads to my knowledge building. And I must confess that it's important to note that for me, it's about my vulnerability during the research, and also the confidence that I had in the process alongside my epistemic humility. I just couldn't help but bow my head and listen attentively to this community of practitioners who spoke to me from their hearts. I felt and I interacted with their passion. I interacted with their experiences, and then I also interacted with their emotions. And I want to say that categorically, this research is not about an assessment or evaluation of Mennonite Central Committee, no. But however, this research uses the global peace building, humanitarian assistance and development paradigm of Mennonite Central Committee to actually explore the research questions which I had. And these research questions actually were based on the fact that some years back, while I was at a policy roundtable, and we had a heated conversation about how to construct the narrative of conflict within a particular community or a region in a particular country. And there on the table was this veteran who has actually worked with the US government. And this veteran says to me outrightly, when I made a suggestion. Now, what was the suggestion? I suggested to say, hey, look, it's important that we invite a practitioner from that community, from that region, to come speak to us so that we have an insight and a knowledge about their own experiences. And this veteran says to me, hey, Charles, you know what? Yes, we can actually invite them, but however, we do have the superior knowledge. So whatever they say, we decide how we construct the narrative. And for me, that was a sting. And that sting was what made me to say, okay, you know what? I have to actually explore the interaction between local practitioners per se, that is local non-governmental organizations. Here, I want to say that using of the term non-governmental organization is general. I am generalizing so long as it is a non-profit organization, either formal or informal. But so I said, okay, now with my own experience in Nigeria, where I interacted with international non-governmental organization professionals, I know that my own experience was unique and different, such as also with that of each and every one of us also who are in the field or either in scholarship. And so I said, sometimes you realize that on the display here, you see that national superpowers or global superpowers, those governments who are donors, you know, there are so many of them. You have the USA, you have Canada, you have Britain, you have Germany, and then also you have regional blocks, for example, who give in money and invest in international development. And sometimes you realize that intergovernmental organizations or multilaterals or even government agencies, for example, who get this money from these governments, in a way, now give this money to international non-governmental organizations who seek and request for grants. And so when these INGOs, for example, some, I want to be very, very emphatic here, I'm talking about some. So when some of these INGOs who have access to this money power, this soft power that comes from governments, then they will now in turn tend to, in a way, impose or say to those local organizations who don't have access to these monies directly, they say to them, hey, we have grants for so and so projects. And if you want to do this project, this is the way we want it to be done. So this, for me, and for those other members of this community of practice, is a form of imposition. So it's like you are trapped, you don't have a choice. And because you have limited the resources, or because you do not have the access to these resources, you end up complying. And then when you comply, in a way, it shrinks your creativity. It shrinks your ability to do that which you think is genuine from you. And so what it means is communities are unable to design their own programs or to design their own initiatives to even implement as a result of lack of resources. And so I would say that we see that the culture, indigenous epistemology, and context of local NGOs, for example, tend to be less weighty in comparison to the money bags and the epistemology and paradigms and methodologies of Western international governmental organizations and their social networks, alongside even their geopolitical power. And we see that playing out now. You and I do know that there is now a great disruption in the international development system. And it's because of the effect of soft power. And so I kind of said to myself that my own positionality then is, in a way, some form of subjectivity. But again, in this subjectivity, I tend to embrace the fact that research ethics and the values of my research, for of course, which I lean on inevitably and transparently towards my research participants, for example, shows a responsibility and credibility. And so what it means is that the research integrity is actually anchored on my own positionality. And so my positionality is here, that the way I see things might be different from the way you see things. On the screen, what comes to your mind first might be an individual face, but it goes beyond that. And so that led to me actually doing this research. It critically explores and contextualizes localism or local term from primary and secondary sources. It uses Mennonite Central Committee's ground-up global paradigm, as I mentioned earlier. Then what does it do? I use that lens to investigate and analyze the underlying mechanisms or barriers in the relationship between international non-governmental organizations and local non-governmental organizations. And then to note that my research highlights that global development practice and epistemology actually are markers of power asymmetries in partnerships between the global north and the global south. And then also we see that this is reflected in decision-making, representation, organizational culture, and language as well. And you and I do know that in scholarship, in critical scholarship, this is actually referring to some form of coloniality. And then it informs us the fact that INGO and local NGO point towards the formation of a community of practice, which I mentioned earlier, and then a possible learning community or a community of pedagogy, which indispensably reflects authentic partnerships of inclusive pluralism and participation. In the essence, what I mean to say in this research and what I want to bring out is the fact that the role of power in the relationships and interactions in the field is fundamental. It's critical. And of course, it's good to know that its dynamics play out intentionally or unintentionally among actors. And then I must confess, it's intrinsically complex, multi-layered, and multi-dimensional. And so I decided to frame a theory of change for this research. And the theory of change is actually informed by the theoretical frameworks in both my primary and secondary sources, and then also from my research objectives and also the statement of the problem. And it states, if the dissertation discovers 6 unhealthy mechanisms in the asymmetrical relationships between INGOs and LNGOs, then the dissertation will create awareness and advocate for a restorative, collaborative paradigm to enable shared power and mutuality toward consolidating localization of efficient peace building and development efforts of local actors within their context and culture. And so I want to know that this case study will inform peace building theory and policy in responding to the tension between conceptualizations and contextualization, and also adding to the discourse of the problem of asymmetrical NGO relationships. Now, just to note that this research is a semi-participatory and qualitative exploratory research. How do I mean by semi-participatory? By semi-participatory, I mean that the researcher went into this context and intentionally invited some key practitioners who are trusted in the communities where they serve. And these individuals form what the researcher calls the research discussion team, RDT. They were 6 in number, including me, making 7. And we tried to gender balance it. And then also having in mind that this group of individuals will enjoy a shared power space, a safe space, and then co-creation took place in the sense that the researcher shared with this group the research questions, the rationale for the research, and this group discussed the research questions with the researcher. In fact, there was 100.5% acceptance and affirmation on the research questions. And so what it meant was the consolidation of the relevance of the research questions. And then the data collection was through hybrid interview. I had previously intended to travel to Nigeria to do interviews, face-to-face interviews, and then do some face-to-face interviews in the US. But as time went on and and dynamics emerged, I wasn't able to travel. And so what happened was that I had to do the recruitment and invite participants randomly in order for them to participate via Zoom. And then also when I traveled to Zimbabwe, I was able to interview some of the key participants who traveled from Nigeria to Zimbabwe. And so that makes it hybrid in the sense that there were both face-to-face interviews in person and then also virtual interviews. And then just to note that the research that I have presented is actually structured into 10 chapters. And as I noted earlier, I made you to understand that a research discussion committee was formed, and that is the reason why this research is a semi-participatory kind of research, because this team or this group represented the communities that they serve, and these communities actually were the same communities from where you have some of these research participants who responded to the interviews. And I want to note that the questions basically were on how and why of NGO relationships, the how and the why. This how and why are important because these are influencing attributes to my choice of the data analysis and coding analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, it was through random recruitment. And remember, I mentioned I worked in Nigeria, and so I built my network, and I have sustained that network with this peace building community. Even when I'm working for MCC, whenever I traveled to Nigeria, for example, or to visit our program sites. And then, of course, the communications were via emails and phone calls and Zoom sometimes. And just to note also that the number of participants, the number of research participants who were interviewed are 79. And these 79 were drawn out of the pool of about 97 research participants that I proposed earlier, randomly. So you had 54 men and 25 women. And the amount of minutes from the interviews is 2,475 minutes, 0.28 minutes, seconds. So, and each interview ranged between 60 minutes to 90 minutes. Of course, there were some that were shorter than 60 minutes. And remember again, the sites for the interviews were here in the USA, then virtually Nigeria, where you have Plateau State and Anambra State and Borno State alongside Kano and Abuja. So the category of the research participants, I just want to note that we have practitioners, we have scholars and practitioners / consultants, and then also we have a category of participants who are members of the Movement for Community-Led Development. Then we have some participants who were also members of the Washington, D.C. advocacy community, where I am actually affiliated to this community because that is where I work. And then also we have community members who are beneficiaries of the programs that international non-governmental organizations implement, or even the programs that local non-governmental organizations implement, either international non-governmental organizations implementing via local non-governmental organizations, or local non-governmental organizations implementing directly themselves from their own resources. And you see that I have presented some kind of coding for these practitioners. So I want to note that these practitioners are men and women, international and local, faith-based and non-faith-based peace building and development practitioners who operate in Nigeria. This category comprises of MCC partners, non-MCC partners, and MCC staff who are either current, retired, or previous. And then also, I want to emphasize that as regards to their professional engagements, these are top-level executives or program or project leaders. And so what it means is that they interact with the context, the culture, and then also other actors in the field. And then these men and women, these individuals are beyond the age of 18, and they are from different religious backgrounds. And I want to say that initially I reached out to 69 prospective participants within this category, but received affirmation from 52. So 52 of them were interviewed. You see P1 indicates the coding of the identification of the practitioners or the research participants. So I have them as from P1 to P52. And then the second category of respondents, the participants, are scholar practitioners or scholar practitioners consultants. So these are either international or local scholars who are also practitioners and then are also consultants. And so what it means is that they have the knowledge and the opportunity to interact both domestically and internationally. And they also share from the same tagline, which I said about the practitioners. Their age, above 18, from different religious background as well. And they are coded and they identified as P53 to P64. Then you have the movement for community-led development. Now, this is a movement where you have people from different corners of the globe converging together in a community of practice. And their vision is locally led development or localization, as it may be, community-led. And within this category, I reached out to about 19 of them, but at the end of the day, it was only 2 that were interviewed who affirmed and received and acknowledged the invite. Also, the Washington, D.C. advocacy community, they identify them as P67 to P70. These are men and women who are engaged in United States policymakers' engagement, the Congress, USAID, and the State Department and the administration and other government agencies to influence US government policies on international development, including peacebuilding and humanitarianism. And I just want to note that only four affirmed and received the invitation to be interviewed. And then the research participants who are from the community, these are the beneficiaries. They were 9 in number, P71 to P79. These, of course, are men and women who directly receive the services of international non-governmental organizations and local non-governmental organizations. And so they have their own lens of viewing and interpreting and analyzing and assessing the dynamics that emerge in the relationship between international non-governmental organizations and local non-governmental organizations. Let me point out here that the research questions were not sent out to these participants ahead of time. It was intentional. I sent out, the researcher sent out the research questions on the day. In fact, at the time of the interview was the first time that these research participants were actually hearing and knowing the research questions. it was to generate organic responses. I know you might say, but what about those of them whom you recruited to form the RDT? Yes, of course. Those were privileged because they discussed the interview questions with me. But however, I do think that they saw the questions coming in as new to them because they had given me the go-ahead to actually change if I want to change any language or tweak it or not. And so the intention was to generate organic responses for these 10 open-ended questions. And their responses were recorded and notes were taken. And I want to say that I sent out research invitations via emails and then also via phone calls. Why would I do that with phone calls? Because most of the community members, beneficiaries, didn't have access to emails. And so I had to communicate with them via phone calls. And then also the informed consent and the confidentiality clause were also shared with them on the day of the interview. And I want to note that there was active listening and the interview spaces were accommodative. And I tried to be as patient as I could. Honestly, I learned a lot. And that made me to grow as a researcher, developing an epistemic humility posture. Now, these are some of the questions. How would you assess the work of local NGOs in northern Nigeria? Can you mention some factors or issues which make their efforts efficient or inefficient? How would you describe the relationship between INGOs and LNGOs in northern Nigeria? In contrast to existing peace-building interventions or programs, what effective local interventions can faith-based local non-governmental organizations implement to address violent conflicts in northern Nigeria? Then there is this one. How distinct and different are these local or contextual approaches compared to the interventions designed by INGOs or by both INGOs and LNGOs? I want to say that at the time that after listening to these interviews and transcribing these interviews and doing the data analysis, I was in the phase of triangulating my findings. And that was the time when I was privileged to publish two articles that were deeply reflective on shifting power dynamics, localization, and decolonization, and then also navigating the complexities of interreligious peace building, implications for theory and practice. And I must say that my coding analysis and data analysis were manual. Yes, that was crazy. It was self-inflicted. Manual in the sense that I had intended to use the in vivo software, but because it was costly, so I had to kind of like do a deep personal search to say, hey, look, why not you do it manually? And then probably at the end of the day, do some comparisons if you would want to. And so I used what they call the DIP qualitative coding strategies. And which means description, interpretation, and presumption qualitative coding strategies. And so what I did was to collect the relevant data from the interviews, from the pool of data, and then I created what they call anchor codes. So now on the margin, on the edge of this transcript, you would see a yellow marker. So the yellow marker is what I used for the anchor codes. So I created anchor codes from the relevant research questions, from the key research questions. And creating these anchor codes will enable me to get the answers or the relevant information that I will need from the responses of the participants. So here, the first anchor code is actually drawn from question question number 3. So the question number 3, how would you assess the work of LNGOs in northern Nigeria? Can you mention some factors affecting their affecting them? So the anchor code here is LNGOs factors for short. And then you will see that I used a green marker to highlight the response, some of these responses from these participants. So these responses, these sentences highlighted on green are for me the relevant information that I put into the initial table, for example, where I have the empirical codes. So these sentences highlight, or these responses highlighted in green, are regarded as empirical codes. These are the empirical codes. So they are the relevant ones that tend to respond, that tend to give answers to the question about the factors affecting local NGOs. And then also question number 4 has this anchor code, relationship between INGOs and LNGOs. So the same, and then you will see that on the other side, the left-hand side of the transcript, you will see my remarks. I scribed, for me, I am interpreting the meaning. I am interpreting the responses. So those are, for me, the interpretations. And then also I am drawing out from there the codes that I will use at the end of the day, and then I will group them at the end of the day. So that continues. And then go to this, see. So now you see this on this table, you will see that I have anchor codes, I have empirical indicator, and then I have empirical indicator meaning. Then I have my reflections on the meaning of the empirical indicator. That is the meaning drawn from the empirical indicator. That is the response to the question by the participants. And then there is the session on research question answer. So I ask myself, does this participant actually answer the question, the research question? And then also after that is my code description. I now describe in my own words what I think should be the code. And so here you see from the response of P47, the same transcript that I displayed earlier, you will see that for me, the code drawn from the empirical indicator and the meaning of the empirical indicator that aligns with my reflection is that there are internal and external factors affecting the work of local NGOs. And so the code is INGO templated interventions and paradigm actually are one of the key factors that affect the work of local NGOs. And so for me, the description is local NGO efforts are impaired by many external factors. So it goes the same with all other responses. Let me go back to the slide. Okay, that's all about the DIP strategy. And so I want to emphasize before I continue that the reason why I chose the interpretation and presumption focused coding strategy, remember I made mention the fact that the interview questions were on how and why of the NGO relationships. So the goal is to display judgment, to explain and describe the phenomenon, especially the mechanisms of power. And then remember that the key questions from my interview questions were what and how. Those are the features. And I want to highlight, in as much as I have pointed out the first table, I want to point out that the whole scenario of my data analysis and coding are displayed on the screen. The first, you have the raw data. And then from the raw data, I now create anchor codes. After creating anchor codes, I had to they identify the transcripts as you saw on the screen. P47, for example. So P47 means participant number 47. And then after that, I went ahead to then identify empirical indicators. So after identifying the empirical indicators, I went to generate the meanings. After generating the meanings, the reflection of the meanings, answering of the questions, and then creating codes. And then after that, there is another table on which you see the analysis where I developed the code descriptions and code frequencies, and then developed categories and generated sub-teams and then teams. And then I assigned meaning to the teams. Let me go back again. So from all the categories, now this is the categories of advocacy community in DC from P67 to P70. Now, these are their codes. These are the codes that I generated. So you will see that from the LNGO factors, you will see lack of capacity. That is for P67. Then P68 says, I got lack of funding and resources. Then P69, you have lack of strong LNGO systems / resources. Then P70 says lack of INGO trust, LNGO capacity, and anti-NGO government policies. And so the frequencies, I pulled from each category the frequency of the codes. Now the frequency for this is 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. From the 4 participants, we have a uniform code frequency that says lack of funding / resources, INGO hash policies. So that is how I went all through to generate the teams. So I did that to generate the teams. So these are the teams: capacity, context, policies, multiplicity of strategies, global inequality, dynamism, purposeful relationships. I will just read out each team. Now, for capacity, it states that, look, LNGOs lack various forms of capacity which are critical and fundamental, thereby becoming inefficient. There is no time. I would have read some of the key responses from the participants regarding capacity that tend to pull out this theme that reflects here. And then for context, it states that local context, knowledge, culture, and agenda of local actors alongside understanding, that is their own understanding, influence the dynamics and the relationships between INGOs and LNGOs. Then for policies, it says that policies formulated and implemented by some INGOs, donors, and powerful development actors affect the relationship between INGOs and LNGOs and their operationalization. Then for multiplicity of strategies, it says that the design and implementation of programs are adaptable, must incorporate unscientific and unconventional, spontaneous and simultaneous interventions. And then for dynamism, it says that the approaches and strategies must contextually be sensitive and appropriate, active and evolving to accurately respond to the emerging dynamics. And what about global inequality? Global development inequality reflects harmful effects and the impacts of colonial legacies. And of course, we see that playing out in the mechanisms of power. And then purposeful relationship. Purposeful relationships states that purposeful relationships by INGOs and LNGOs are complex and transformative when they are mutually beneficial, collaborative, and sustainable. Then after this, we now got the factors affecting LNGOs. The factors were also drawn in the same style of manner that those teams were also pulled out from. You have insecurity, duplication, local government policies and laws, organizational system, organizational integrity, And for insecurity, ongoing recurring violent conflicts affect the effectiveness of local NGOs. And then also we see that when local NGOs duplicate interventions, it causes unhealthy conflict amongst NGOs. And then organizational structure, organizational system, structures, tangible and intangible management dynamics and operational capacities are lacking within some local NGOs. And then what about organizational integrity? It has to do with accountability and ethical, operating and the management style within local NGOs. So when they are found wanting, it affects their trust and their effectiveness. Then local government policies and laws formulated and enacted by local and national governments impede LNGO effectiveness. Then, finally, I want to talk about the mechanisms of power. So, when I was during the interview, in fact, analyzing the responses of participants, I noted that I will just go straight to point out. So, mentorship is the way international NGOs tend to mentor local NGOs. For some, it is unhealthy. The same with the grant assessment. It is almost impossible for local organizations to actually access foreign grants. It is almost impossible. You must be aligned. You must be connected. You must work with an international non-governmental organization of influence for you to have access to external funding. Then skills and professional development, expertise. Sometimes local NGO approaches and expertise and knowledge are regarded as inferior in comparison to that of international professionals, of course. So it plays out. Then the design and implementation. When INGOs call for local organizations to access their grants and implement programs, of course, you're going to have to implement the templated initiatives and interventions which they have already designed to align to accessing that grant. And so they see it as an imposition. Narrative construction. Who tells the story? The international organization, the international non-governmental organization tells the story in this context on your behalf, not even asking you as the primary primary community that is affected by the context, by the conflict, to tell your story. And so they are the ones that design the narrative in order to access those grants from governments, of course, the sources of soft power. The moral challenges of practice. Of course, some approaches of international non-governmental organizations seem to be unethical in a way, and that tends to affect the values, the axiology of some of these local non-governmental organizations. So I want to note here, finally, that a mentorship, which is one of the mechanisms of power, in response to questions 3, 5, and 8, from the practitioners category, this mentorship was generated 138 times. That is the frequency. That's from 79 participants. They say that mentorship is unhealthy. The way the INGOs mentor them is unhealthy. And then from scholars, practitioners, consultants, it is 44 times. And then from the advocacy community of four respondents is 14 times. From the MCLD of two participants is 8 times. And for community members of 9, it is 20 times. Then the access to grants and funding, which is material, you will notice that from practitioners, it's 133 times. Scholars, practitioners, consultants, 33 times. Advocacy community, 12 times. MCLD, 4 times. And then beneficiaries, 14 times. For design and implementation, which is the technical, practitioners, 99 times. Scholars, practitioners, 23 times. Advocacy community, 8 times. then MCLD 4 times, and then beneficiaries 14 times. For skills, practitioners 136 times, scholars and practitioners 23 times, advocacy community 8 times, MCLD 4 times, and then beneficiaries 14 times. That is from those who are beneficiary to these services. Then narrative, practitioners 136, scholars practitioners 23, advocacy community 8, MCLD 4, community members 14. Then finally, moral challenges of practice, 136 times, scholars 23, advocacy community 8, and then that's it. So there are two paradigms that I conclude with. The restorative collaborative paradigm and the emancipatory elicitive religious peace building. For the restorative collaborative paradigm, I would say that the issue of harm or harmful relationships necessitate restoring and repairing relationships, accountability, responsibility, and transparency. And so what we see is a situation whereby the ability of this paradigm to incorporate those aspects of experiences of practitioners, which is their phenomenology, and then their values as found in their ethics, and their metaphysical connections as found in their epistemology also, and the dimensions of peace building reflect its elasticity to adapt conventional and unconventional approaches. And so what it means is that this paradigm incorporates the Ubuntu philosophy and the restorative justice values. So the values of these, the values of both Ubuntu and restorative justice tend to enable the actors who have already experienced broken relationships due to power domination, for example, to dialogically communicate compassionately in a way of shared values and shared space, in such a way that the dignity of both INGO and any NGO are respected and affirmed in a way in order to create a reflective community of practice. And having said that, I would say that the self-reflective activities of NGOs would offer moments of self-discovery and enlightenment, learning and unlearning, cultural competencies, and decolonization for dignity and critical. Okay. And then finally, the emancipatory elicitive religious peace building incorporates the metaphysical aspect of relationships in communities, their experiences, and their values in order to lead towards a just peace. So a just peace brings in the religious lens to its approach. And then what it means is that in circumventing mechanisms of power, this paradigm offers a testimonial of new ways of doing things through the principle of inclusive pluralism. It necessitates practitioners, policymakers, and theorists to phenomenologically and metaphysically actually in their own frameworks and committed to the ethics of the field. I think with that, I would say that I outlined about 8 to 9 characteristics of a context-based sensitive localization to say that no matter its form, localization must be sensitive to dynamic, must be appropriate to the needs of communities, and communities must participate equitably, and there must be shared power and responsibility and accountability, and of course, affirmation and respect and acknowledgement alongside acknowledging the potency of all agencies of actors. And then it must be mutually beneficial and contextually and culturally sensitive, unbiased and adaptive to conventional and unconventional aspects, unconditionality in external and foreign resources. And then again, capacity is inherent. And of course, the local resources must be sought first because context and actors and cultures are primary. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Charles. This is definitely worth an applause. I can't see the many virtual participants here, but very thorough summary. So let's move now to the committee members. I invite Professor Fortes to present his evaluation. Al?
Yes, thank you, Dan, and Charles, congratulations. Your study, your project, your dissertation really is multifaceted and multidimensional. And by the way, I would like to extend my greetings to everyone who is joining us. I noticed that I think I have a couple of friends, people I know from the Mennonite community. So yes, thank you. You know what, Charles? When I was reading your dissertation, there was a sense of spark on me because your focus basically reminds me of our work as well. This is just a very brief kind of sharing as I move to my main comments. Your dissertation reminds me of our ongoing work in the Philippines as well, the whole issue of decolonization. In fact, we call it Philippinization, especially against the backdrop of the 400 years of being colonized by Spain, followed by the United States. And so there was also that attempt to really find our niche, to really find our voice, and also for the Filipinos to become the authors and narrators of their story, because they are the local experts. And I think, and we want the Filipinos to be the ones assigning words into their mouth. And I think this basically is very much reflected as well in your research and study. And also, this reminds me of my work in my master's on global partnership. So going to a few of my comments. Dan, what is the dynamics here? Shall I just, go ahead and present all my comments, questions?
If you want, however you want to. present
Okay.
it,
Okay.
all Individual or, yeah.
Sure, definitely. So Charles, if you don't mind, just kind of, take note of some of these comments. Okay, the first one is this whole idea of verses, which right away intrigues me because, this is right on your dissertation title. Still, I had the opportunity to read your entire material, but a part of me, at the back of my mind, there is still that lingering question: why versus instead of and or something to do with the dynamic interplay between internationalism and localism? I know you basically articulated your response to that, but there's still that lingering thought at the back of my mind. Maybe because this is partly due to my notion of peace building, you know, peace building that needs this too, the local aspect, community based, and also the international aspect, meeting somewhere, and so I wonder if maybe I just missed this, if there's also the importance of the middle entity somewhere that would somehow bring this to, the local community based and also the international party together. Because I think, peace building needs these two parties for as long as there is careful listening, there is respect, and also there is that, goal, which is for the common good of everyone. And for as long as the whole process of peace building or development, does not lead to what we call donor-led definitions, donor-led agenda, and donor-led strategies. And in fact, that was part of your conclusion, this whole South African notion of Ubuntu. My humanity is caught up in your humanity. So I was wondering if, the title truly reflects the richness of the content of your study, or it might be something worth revisiting, because as I was reading your conclusion, you actually highlighted, the emerging paradigms. Okay, you highlighted, this restorative collaboratory paradigm and emancipatory elicitive religious paradigm. And it seems like you actually bring this to some kind of an integrative approach, and so, but again, the title, remains to be versus. So I was wondering how you might kind of take this into consideration. Okay. My next comment here, Charles, is the anecdotes, which comprise, or those individual narratives, the answers to your interview questions comprising chapter 7, 8, and 9. I tell you, they are extremely rich, very, very rich. However, I also feel like there's so much to unpack in each of those individual responses. Part of my response here is, you basically highlighted, like literally the entire story or the entire response for each of those, under, of course, a specific, a common theme. So I just felt like, as I was going through those individual responses, I noticed that there's a lot to unpack, which could perhaps be part of the narrative analysis. You highlighted that. However, I was also looking for perhaps for a more cohesive, presentation of your analysis based on these individual responses. I was also expected to be able to capture, was for me, the nuances in terms of where those individual responses or narratives kind of overlap, and not just based on the common theme. Because if you notice the way you presented them, you base them according to the common themes, but then as I was going over those individual stories, I sensed that there are actually overlapping themes. There are also nuances, and what one participant said in relation to or relative to the other, actually they also have some unique responses, but somehow your presentation just brings them together under one, common theme as your sectional heading. So, and another comment, and these are minor comments that I have, Charles. I was going over your table of contents, and I was hoping if you could actually be more specific in terms of what those sections are about, because I noticed you just said section 1, section 2, and then all those things without specific designation, and I was very much excited to really hear about that. And also in the actual narrative, if you could also assign sectional headings. I think this is more for me as the reader, for my guidance in terms of what sections are you referring to now. Okay, and then I would there were a couple times when I would refer to your table of contents, but then there was no specific indications. So I was perhaps that's something you can address as well. I'm getting there. I have two more, Dan, and this is again a minor comment. The in-text citations, perhaps, especially, there are sections in your writing where you highlighted several citations under the same. So I wonder if there's something you can just put them under one big parenthesis, including a couple of the footnotes. And finally, Charles, another minor response. On page 4, you mentioned something about nonlinear approach as non-scientific and less international standards. Yes, I totally there's truth to that, from the West, for example, from the perspective of the United States, for example, this is right away considered something that is unscientific because this is also very much reflective of the culture, the context, especially communities that are collectivist, However, I would like to, I was curious if this is something you could also maybe talk more, elaborate this particular thing, because this is your presentation is this is a conclusive statement, but there was no further, explanation that came with that. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for now.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, Charles,
Yeah.
you want to go for a time?
Yes, do I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you all for your observations and
You're
remarks.
welcome.
Yeah. So I want to begin from the last to the first of your questions and remarks. So yeah, the issue of unscientific and unconventional, the reason why you see me highlighting that statement and that position is the fact that veracity of processes are actually based on scientific approaches. So, and scientific frameworks. And so ideally, what it means is that so long as whatever process you are designing is not verifiable through science in whatever frame or paradigm, what it means is that it is less variable and acceptable in the field. And we see this tension play out. And that is the tension between the global northern scholars, practitioners, and the global southern scholars and practitioners. The fact that, for example, one says to you, oh, okay, good. So this process, what makes it verifiable? I mean, and then someone from a community tells you, hey, look, even before the advent of scientific and technological approach to peacebuilding, for example, traditional societies and communities have actually mitigated and confronted their challenges and have resolved issues in their own way, which were unscientifically measured or assessed. So that was the reason why I used that to present a position of the tension between unconventional approaches and conventional approaches. And then on the issue of citations, yes, I acknowledge that some of these citations are long, and I want to confess, honestly speaking, at some point in time, I was caught up in between. I am human. And so remember what I said about my positionality. I needed not only to be accountable to the voices, to the emotions, to the experiences, to the responses of my participants, but also to affirm and acknowledge and transparently and accountably and responsibly present their positioning. And that is why sometimes from the response of anecdotes and quotations, for example, you go halfway, you realize that, oh gosh, the remaining ones are still relevant because the remaining points tend to kind of highlight and enflesh in a way even what has been said previously. So in order not to miss the meaning as intended by the respondent, that is the reason why sometimes I say to myself, oh, okay, I think it will be best to have this play out all through in order to get a sense of the meaning and because here, meaning making is highly important. So the meaning making that I, as the researcher, puts forward to a particular quotation, ideally should align with the meaning making that the respondent has actually displayed in that response. Then on the issue of the table of content, yes, I apologize. That has been fixed. So I tried to print it out, but I wasn't able. But please, it has been fixed, and you will get that in the next email. Then on the issue of verses and so in philosophy, approach to a contentious issue has always been either via positiva or via negativa. That is going the positive way or the positive path or frame or the negative frame or path. And so how do you bridge and compromise this tension as an integrator? So I see myself as a researcher who is an integrator. I want to bridge the divides. And because I want to bridge the divides, I need to name cautiously. So it's about being cautiously as a scholar in naming. And so I asked myself even, why would I say that there is a tournament between Harrisonburg Falcons, for example, versus Fairfield Eagles? It is so. If I say there is a contest between Harrisonburg Falcons and Fairfield Eagles, I am literally saying the same thing because it's about the path that we take. So the verse. So I want to say the verse and the end as almost saying the same thing, because in my conclusion, I tend to bring out the fact that there is distinctiveness between internationalism and localism. And that was why in the principles that I propose, the 8 to 9 principles that I propose about localization, for example, that tends to kind of enflesh. And then if you see my comment about hybridity, for example, you will see that yes, it in a way explains the title of the dissertation, which is internationalism versus localism. Yeah, I think that's all from me. I'm not sure if I responded to your question, but you will let me know.
Thank you, Charles.
All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Al and Charles. Mark Gopin, Professor Gopin, please.
Hi, Charles. It's an honor to be here with you, and I just want to say first of all that your courage all these years to be so persistent with a rather complicated topic and to take it all on and to study the relationship between internationals and locals, and that in all its complexity, and particularly in terms of NGOs, is something that you've been dreaming about for years. And I remember talking to you about it for a long time now, and watching the evolution and development of your methodologies, of trying to get a handle on this, of trying to make sense of this, has been it's a remarkable achievement, and it's a testimony on a very technical level to your capacity as a scientist of this field. And I am honored to both talk to you about this and listen to you all these years, and also debate with you, because that's exactly, how we all learn more, is by debate or different ideas. So your accomplishments here are tremendous, and they're successful, and I'm very gratified to have been a small part of it in the early development of your thinking and intentions on, especially on rescuing the local from various ways in which it can get buried. I have, and so to be autobiographical for a minute, as soon as you started talking to me about this years ago, I felt a strong kinship, because much of my life has been, for 40 years, has been a dichotomy between being in very privileged places of power and abandoning those to be in very underprivileged spaces in the local region with people who couldn't possibly compete for any of these international funds. And so I did very radical things in my life. Not only did I try to build theory on this, but basically I was rolling around in the dirt and dust with a lot of very, very concrete practitioners, extremely poor, extremely marginalized, doing extraordinary things because they were gifted in emotional intelligence, gifted in peace building, and yet entirely unrecognized in the world because they did not have the power structures behind them that said, this is brilliant work. So I want to start with this simple paradox, and maybe take it off from the sports experiment with two tribes in Nigeria. And I want to look at it from the vantage point of a coach, you know, a 20, 30-year-old coach who is, his genius is being able to get these kids to work together and even love each other, despite the fact that they came from clans and families and communities that had hurt each other badly. And his genius is how to do that. And that genius is at the core of a lot of our theories of what works in peace building, like contact theory and many of the things, the psychosocial processes that we have all worked on. So that's on one side. And on the other side, I want to challenge and complexify the issue of power as you go up from that local actor. And that is that internationalism is not the only disjunction or the only disconnect from that local. It's anybody with privilege. It's anyone who has a scientific education. It's anybody who's trying to please somebody who has a lot of money. I mean, that's really where the separation begins. You know, and it doesn't really matter whether that government is in Washington or that government is in Lagos or somewhere else. Every government has multiple agendas. Every place of power, every wealthy donor has more than one thing that they are doing. And many of them are being scrutinized based on whether there's scientific proof for something working. But we know in our studies of ethnography and our experiences of practice over the years, and Al can speak to this every bit as much as I can, that there's no, it's not up to science to look at a local situation and say, oh my gosh, these kids were at each other's throats, there were knife attacks, and then this referee comes along and he builds a family out of enemies. This is genius. Let's repeat it. Let's have this referee train other people, et cetera, et cetera. And we can say the same thing about imams and chaplains and priests all throughout the world. And you're right to emphasize the spiritual or religious quality of many of these brilliant actors, is that they have this connectivity to people that's ingenious. But what I'm asking you, in effect, is there any of us who escapes the problem of going up from that moment of genius, moral, spiritual genius in conflict resolution, and what it takes to get money for that? Because as you go up, it gets more and more distanced, and the power is put more and more into the science or the privileged person or the government or the international agency or the international government. And that's a square that we haven't been able to make into a circle. That disconnect is the essence of your dissertation. And so I would ask you to turn it around, because I've spent years now focusing on positive psychology and appreciative inquiry, and really some very interesting work on psychosocial, the psychosocial into the future, in other words, future thinking. What is your ideal relationship between the referee coach who's brilliant at what he does, but has no time for scientific proof and no interest in it, what is the ideal relationship with that person? How do we develop a local and national and international structure that respects that person without turning them into something else because it suits our power interests? You see, what is the ideal? And maybe a better way is also to say, where have you seen it work best? This dissertation is exposing the problem. Where in your travels have you seen it work best? And why?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gopin. So I want to emphasize that the point you raised is highly important, and it is a reality. So in response to your question of whether there is any of us that can actually escape that kind of trap or phenomenon. So my question would be, yes, we can actually escape that trap. In the product which I presented, there was a place I talked about nurturing local curiosity to discovering the potentials and the resources within the local context. And so now, I am not in any way suggesting or preferring isolationism in our field. I am not in any way preferring that. But what this product and the positionality tends to display is the fact that in as much as there is an urge and a need, which is actually indispensable to connect with the other. And that's the reason why in the paradigm, Ubuntu comes to play out. So the essence of Ubuntu is the fact that isolationism is not even an answer to the question of one's epistemology or one's values and practice. And so what it means is that we must interconnect. It's just indispensable. Is that? But again, cautiously, as a privileged outsider, for example, or a privileged insider who comes into a space, who comes into a context, do I come in with that psyche of domination, of control, of fixing? Hey, I have the answer, you don't have the answer. And let us remember that if you critically explore my literature of review, I made that point clear when I was actually reviewing the issue of pedagogy, for example. I read it. But the point I want to make is that if we come in with that sense of epistemic humility, but let me confess again that, you see, in neuroscience, one thing that I discovered at the time of my research is the fact that each and every one of us, each human individual, not only human, and not only, but each being, the ecosystem has the innate capacity to generate a sense of spirituality that aims to compassionate reasoning. It is real. It's in the brain. It is the awakening. In my literature review, I made it clear there that such an awakening is what paves way and what opens the opportunity for those of us, for example, who feel trapped to actually move out of that space, for example, to embracing the other, affirming the other, and being with them in genuine accompaniment. So that is what I'll say. Yeah. And so a sense of ethics, one thing in peace building is that we tend to actually underrate and to displace the ethics of peace building. So I keep asking, where is the ethics of peace building? Where is the ethics of humanitarian assistance? Where is the ethics of development, for example? The very core of global or international development is meeting the needs, also meeting the needs of humans, meeting the needs of the ecosystem, which calls for an accountability and responsibility. So I think that oftentimes we tend to kind of structure our minds, our psyche in such a way that we feel that there is no answer to this if not this. And so you and I do know that universalizing an approach is almost impossible in the field. Universalizing an approach is almost impossible, but you can actually adapt. You can actually adapt from that approach into a context and make sense of it. And that's the reason why what works for the context of that referee, for example, that young referee who seems not to pay attention to scientific methods, for example, might not work for me. And so it is left for him to embrace the space when he trusts the person who comes with the knowledge of the science to communicate, to educate. So how do we interact? I mean, like in the mentorship, for example, in the technical mechanism, for example, some respondents will say, look, the way and in the manner that this style of approach is being communicated or is being put on us, you know, is making us not to even value the ingenuity that we have in our own context. So that's what I would say. And then what else? Yes, and so I'll just leave it at that to say that I agree with you that internationalism is not only a disjuncture, but anyone who tends to ally and play around with power. But again, we must attain that level of awakening. And whether we like, well, I don't know how to put it, but the point still remains that it is almost, in fact, it is a reality that each and every one of us has the capacity, brain-wise, to attain such an awakening. Because neuroimaging and neuroscience has actually developed what we call neurotheology and spirituality. So neurotheology and spirituality creates that path of making us to be aware of the fact that, yes, we can actually attain to that level of coming out of this trap, whether as policymakers or practitioners or scholars.
Wonderful. Dan, can I just 1 minute follow up?
Of course.
So what I'm hearing from you, this is terrific interchange, is what I'm hearing from you is that the via positiva here, the via positiva is epistemic humility and moral responsibility. That an increase in moral responsibility by all actors, whether they are privileged and powerful through education or privileged and powerful through money and donations. The fact is that you can't do this without epistemic humility and without a sense of accountability and moral responsibility of, are we actually doing what we're saying we're doing? And so that rescues the referee or any other brilliant person who's on the ground doing their job, is that if we, as the ones that are enabling the world to know about them or the world to study them or the world to donate to them, that we have a moral responsibility to examine how we're doing that. So those are two elements. I want to side with Al and say that in many ways, this is a moral investigation of localism, more than localism versus internationalism, because I want to emphasize that from a power perspective, all power can corrupt. And that can be local power. It can be that the government ends up representing one tribe more than another, or gold interests or diamond interests. You know, you never know. Power was always there with double agendas. But localism and rescuing the local with epistemic humility seems to be at the core of the message you have for a better path forward. And that's just fantastic. And we have many stories to share on other localisms and comparisons. So that's great.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gopin. I agree with you. So I see that internationalism and localism seems to align with your envisioning of this. That's fine. For me, I don't see. For me, I mean, one will say that why, but I do not see a difference actually from the content and the context of this research. The difference between the verses, and I see them as leading towards the same goal. That's one. And then secondly, I want to affirm and say that one thing that we cannot escape, either as practitioners, policymakers, or scholars, is the phenomenon of rethinking. So we can't escape from that scenario. We must rethink, and it is a continuum. It doesn't end, it doesn't stop. So we must continue to rethink. And for me, this is an aggiornamento. So, and it must continue. So even after this, I must say that maybe tomorrow, some other person might say, hey, this rethink has to be retaught in another pattern through another lens. And so, yes, I agree with you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just say, I have so much to say and I won't because of time constraint. Let me just mention, I've worked with Charles now for about 3 years, and I'm so gratified that we have new insights that went beyond actually my advice, of course. I'm just going to make one point. In a way, Charles's work is so deeply empirical, as Al correctly pointed out, with enormous detail. And then our current conversation has led to deeper philosophical questions about the purpose, the ethics, the epistemology of localism and internationalism. So from positionality, Charles has gone to the complexity of power, and from power, dealing with the complexity of power. That is, with this insight, Charles argues that it's both emancipatory with the insight of its danger. I was struck by the fact that you often use the word unhealthy, which I think is appropriate. But in reflection, and we talked about this a little bit, sometimes that word is not appropriate. That is to say, it's not, power doesn't automatically mean domination and oppression. So it's that complexity of the moral judgment of power that becomes a question, and many different kinds of moral judgments, because as you point out, there's many different kinds of expressions of power, of practices of power. And so that goes to Al's point, which I really like about the word versus. I think we have to figure out a word. I don't know if there's one word to capture it, but it clearly deals with multiple spheres, multiple perspectives, deeply philosophical, ethical, epistemological, power-oriented, multiple spheres of that relationship. And so, anyway, I want to work with you on maybe trying to figure out another word for that.
Sure, sure, that's okay.
And committee.
Sure, that's okay. That's welcome. But again, just to note that I have previously mentioned that in as much as power is not bad, it's not bad in itself.
Necessarily bad,
Yes,
yeah.
and so it is the interaction of power with the social dynamics. And remember, I did explain in one of the slides where I said it could either be intentional or unintentional. And so, but the point still remains that it is a reality that is there, you know. So we all, and I must affirm that both INGOs and LNGOs have their own degree of power.
Yeah.
Seriously, honestly speaking. So yeah.
And internal, obviously.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I agree.
I was hoping to have time. We don't have time for questions or comments from, by the way, we have 67 people participating. Thank you so much for joining this very important event. Okay, I'm already weakening on what I just said. I see a hand up by Professor Majubai. I don't see your full name, so Majubalu.
Yes.
So if you would like to offer a question or comment, and I'm going to respectfully ask this to be brief because we're running out of time for other items. So Professor, yes.
Yes, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I think I am impressed by this work, but I also want to say that the power, the structural power of the actors involved in these interactions differ, because the ones who are giving the material resources and through whom the material resources is being accessed really have more power. And the local NGOs have less, if we're being honest. The kind of power they have is probably that maybe access cannot be had without their involvement, or robust access. And this whole terrain is littered with, I think, the hubris of global North NGOs, whether they're religious or secular, and their intent to be helpful in terms of saying that we are speaking for the voiceless many times. And this kind of imbalance in power also is one where one can question the accountability. To whom are either the local or international NGOs accountable? You know, who kind of produces the agenda that everybody is responding to? So I like this study, but I think for me, the power imbalance is glaring. And, you know, without the local NGOs somehow being able to independently access resources and also gaining structural power within the international system, you know, it's going to continue.
Very brief.
Yes, Prof, I honestly agree with you. So the issue of structural power actually differs, you know, it differs. But again, one thing is we acknowledge that these different forms of sources of power, in the way they are being exercised, or in the way they are being used by the actors, tend to actually determine the qualifying adjective, for example, for such a display of power. So yes, I agree with you. They're different. Thank you so much.
Okay. We have still various functions for this meeting. This event is scheduled to end at 1 o'clock our time, which is in 12 minutes. So I'm sorry to say we just do not have time to fulfill the necessary elements and requirements of a dissertation defense if I continue to allow for more questions. So I apologize for that in advance. And now I'd like to have the committee members meet separately. So Mark and Al, I've created a Zoom link for a separate room. I'm going to go to my office down the hall, send you the link, and then we'll have a conversation. Okay, I'm going to send it to you by email right now. And then we're going to obviously come back after our discussion. Okay?
Okay.
Got that? Got that? All right.
Yeah,
Al,
Dr. Robert,
Al,
yeah, I see Al.
Al's here. Mark had to go because we went over. It is my joyful pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Kwuelum.